Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Manager for Dataversity. We'd like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Metadata Strategies, Data Squared. It's the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken, brought to you in partnership with Data Blueprint. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. If you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. Just click the chat icon in the upper right-hand corner for that feature. For questions, we'll be collecting them via the Q&A in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or if you'd like to tweet, we encourage you to share highlights or questions via Twitter using hashtag DataEd. To answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording, and we'll likewise send a link of the recording to this session, as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now let me introduce to you our speaker for today. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. Peter is also the founding director of Data Blueprint. He has written dozens of articles and 11 books. The most recent is Your Data Strategy. Peter is experienced with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his and Data Blueprint's expertise. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. And with that, I will turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Shannon. You realize this is the end of our 6th year together doing this, so congratulations to you guys as well for keeping us all together and pointed in the right direction. Our topic today is metadata, and we're going to talk about it in a couple different ways. First of all, I'm going to give you a definition as a second piece, but most importantly, give you how metadata fits into data management. So what is it? Why is it important? We'll talk about major types, different subject areas that are in it as well. Look at some benefits, how one applies how one applies metadata practices to what they're doing, and some sources in there. I used to call this strategies, but I decided to relabel it as implementation consideration. Strategy may be a highfalutin word. I'd rather you have a data strategy than a metadata strategy if I had to choose between the two, but we can perhaps talk about that in the Q&A. We'll finish up with some guiding blocks, guiding principles and building blocks, and I like to leave people with a specific teachable example around metadata. So that'll be the 7th segment that we have. We'll get to some takeaways and Q&A, as always, towards the top of the next hour. So let's jump in and get started. Always like to start off by placing this squarely in the context of data management. I do this to, first of all, not remind us that we're immature, but we do have to recognize the fact that we don't have good definitions around some of these terms that we're talking about. And of course, definitions and data are hugely important together. So when we talk about data management, most people think that that's what happens between when data is collected, the sources of it, and when data is used. And that's a good way to conceptualize it. It's just that most people don't understand that that involves some very specific disciplines around data engineering, data storage, and data delivery. And if we've got those 3 pieces that need to be working in concert, then we need to apply a layer of data governance around that as well in order to come up with something that will be cohesive and actually fit for purpose in the organizations. What this means, of course, is that we need to have specialized team skills around all of this. Now, we've used this definition since about 2007. Even it, I still think, is inadequate because what it doesn't show is the most important aspect of data, which is the reuse. And we don't have a good way of describing this. I've got another version of this that I'm working on here. Maybe some of you guys will give me some help on this. We really are talking about, again, the same issues, engineering, storage, and delivery, but now we're really focusing on the resources, the assets that we have as data, and that those assets are delivered to various aspects of the business, and that we need feedback from how each of those aspects of the business is using the data in order to figure out what that is. We call that the analytic insight loop, and that our overall process surrounded by this, of course, still needs to be governed. All of these are wonderful things to think about. They still require the specialized team skills, but we're probably not really at the most precise definition yet. I was in DAME Atlanta last week and had a great session with the folks down there, and they were actually helping to postulate some new ideas on this as well that we'll start to use in all of this. Now, we talk about data, we also like to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and for some reason everybody does remember this. Now, I was in the DEMA Mexico kickoff session last week, no, week before last. There we go, I have to think of where I am. And they, of course, remembered Maslow as well. Most people got this in high school, which is to say that if your food, clothing, and shelter needs are unmet, your physiological needs, if your physiological needs are unmet, you cannot be safe. If you are not safe, then you will never be love and never have love and belonging, never be a part of something. That love and belonging is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite to getting to esteem, which is, respect by other people. And if we don't have esteem, we never get to self-actualization. So really the creativity, the spontaneity things that we're talking about up there, the flow is what many people say at this point in order to do this. You may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with data? Well, a lot of data is falling into that same sort of a trap. You can see from Maslow's diagram there that you cannot just have self-actualization. You must have food, clothing, and shelter. You must be safe. You must have love and belonging. You must have self-esteem before you can even try to get to self-actualization. And in that same way, data is an awful lot like that. We see a lot of things written about these topics, and they are truly technology focused, master data management, data mining, whatever it is that we're trying to do over there. The problem is, of course, that those are just the tip of the iceberg in the data world, and most people don't realize that the rest of the iceberg is what we have to pay attention to, which are really the foundational data management practices, what we've been concentrating on in this webinar here. If you don't have those foundational data management practices in shape, then it means that whatever you're trying to do with those advanced practices will take longer, it will cost you more, it will deliver less, and it will present greater risk to the organization than if instead you learn how to use it well. The bottom half of that pyramid, the foundation of this data management practices hierarchy are really organizational capabilities, and most organizations do not have sufficient capabilities to properly implement the rest of those things at the top, which means that it's going to take longer, cost more, deliver less, and present greater risk to the organizations than if instead you learn to walk, crawl your way to the top. Similarly, we also use the DMM, which is the structure of the 5 integrated practice areas, the ones that were on the bottom in the previous slide. They pop up over here, and what we're talking about is that we've got to have a plan for how we're going to manage our sole non-depletable, non-degrading, durable strategic asset. We need to have a professional class of managers manage our data assets. These are our data governance professionals. We need to have data that is fit for purpose for organizations, and we have to do it with the right technology and with the right processes. We also need some supporting practices in order to make this work. Now, one other piece to understand on this, again, a foundation can only be as strong as its weakest link. So the DMM does, in fact, give you an ability to go through and determine these. I'm going to give you a hypothetical example here. I'm going to pretend that the weak link in this chain is very, very obvious. Data governance, they're performing at a level 3, platform operations, quality, all of these are level 3 practices in this hypothetical example here. But if we don't have a data management strategy here, then the foundation can only be as strong as the weakest link, and it doesn't matter how much money you put into governance or quality or platform or architecture. If you don't take that 1 and make it into a 3, there's no ability for the rest of these to perform where they should. Now, this relates, of course, back to our DMBOK that most of you are familiar with now, and of course, this is the DMBOK 1, and you can see that metadata occupies one of the pie wedges that we had in the original DMBOK. The second version, of course, was released this summer, and we're very proud of the fact that people are adopting it at a very increasing rate. The metadata still shows up there as well. And just for those of you that aren't familiar with the new one, the new wedge on the pie is data integration and interoperability. We may do a webinar on that as well when we get to it. So you can see that metadata management is an important aspect of data management here. This is an overview from the first DMBOK. We didn't include these in the second DMBOK, but the charts are still very, very useful, which shows you on the left-hand side the inputs, the green part, the activities, and the deliverables as the outputs on the other side. And this ability to show all of this in an integrated fashion and to work with it is absolutely a key part in data management. So that's our context piece. Now let's talk about what is it and why is it important. First of all, in the history of language, when we had words to form a combined concept, we stuck a hyphen in between them. Over time, as it becomes used, it becomes less important to have a hyphen. And so even though there is a copyright on the word metadata, it has not been enforced. So that's why most people shied away from it, because they were afraid that somebody was going to sue them. Actually, I think you'll find that the patent office will not enforce this patent at all. It's kind of like Bill Gates patenting all the zeros and the ones out there and saying they belong all to him. He would never do that, and I don't think they would enforce that as well. So let's call it metadata as just one word rather than with a space or with a hyphen in it. Most people get this definition about metadata in that it is data about data. Now that leaves us with an important criteria, first of all. If we have metadata and we start to put into it data about data, then that means that metadata is data. So it should be treated like data. And we need the same set of skills, although notice I've put the word meta in front of data engineering, meta in front of storage, meta in front of delivery, and meta in front of governance. Metadata, though, is managed in exactly the same fashion as data is. If it wasn't, why would you do anything differently? So everything we've already learned about data management technologies and techniques is applicable to metadata. And that means that a lot of you know a lot more than you think in terms of metadata. Now, I'd like to, at this point of the presentation, just sort of take a pause and say another way to get people to understand the importance of metadata is that somewhere in your organization you have a group that's called networking or something similar. Networking, of course, is responsible for knowing exactly what devices are permitted to log onto the network and what are the locations of all the access points. And this takes a responsibility belonging to a specific named individual, as in there is somebody who is responsible for this. Well, they are doing metadata management within the context of networking operations for your organization. And similarly, you want to make sure that you make people understand that you've got to have the same type of access provided to your data. If you do not, you have another sort of wild, wild west situation out there. So I've had a lot of people thank me for that particular example. Let's take a look at another definitional piece around here. There are lots of meanings to the prefix meta. The one that we're using here is number 4, beyond, transcending, more comprehensive, or at a higher state of development. That is data that has got some specialness about it. And let's talk about that. Metadata is everywhere in data management, and it's integral to all IT systems and applications. Metadata is to data what data is to real life. Data reflects the real life transactions, events, and objects. Metadata reflects data transactions, events, and objects, relationships, et cetera, et cetera. David Hayes' wonderful book here on requirements enterprise modeling is describing the structure and workings of the organization's use of information, and that describes the systems that it uses to manage the information. Data, from an older Gardner definition, data describes various assets, facets of the data asset for the purpose of improving its usability. Then they improved it. They came up with a better definition the next year. Metadata unlocks the value of data and therefore requires management attention. I like that one in particular. Metadata management, then, is the set of processes that ensure the proper creation, storage, integration, and control to support the associated use of metadata. So all of that's giving you some words. Let's look at an analogy that may be helpful. Unfortunately, we're going to have to give up this analogy sometime sooner or later because you can imagine the kids. What's a card catalog? What's a library? But at least for those of us on the call, we can agree here that this is somewhat simpler. The card catalog in a library identifies what books are in the library, where they are located. This allows you to search by subject area. For example, if I'm looking for organized crime fiction, I might get a John Grisham book. Or I might look by the author. What other books has John Grisham written because I like John Grisham books? Or the title. There was this book called The Firm. I don't know who wrote it. Well, this is what you use a card catalog for. Now, we know that most of our card catalogs have been converted to electronic means, but the purpose still shows the author, the subject tags, the publication date, the revision history, and it allows you to look at this metadata about the book to determine whether that book will meet your needs. Now, in the old days, you would then go off to that part of the library and find the book. Of course, now it's usually just a click away, and we can do it. Without the card catalog, though, you'd actually have to find each of the books, and that's generally not as helpful as using metadata to find it. Take a couple more definitional pieces as well. Metadata is the card catalog in the managed data environment. Metadata are the descriptive tags or the context of the data in that environment. Metadata shows businesses and technical users where to find information on the data repository, Metadata provides the details where the data comes from, how it got there, provenance, et cetera, and it provides assistance with what the data really means and how to interpret it. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples here, talk about two companies in particular. First one is Nokia. Nokia worked with for a number of years, as you heard earlier. They had something in Nokia that was called the Nokia Term Bank, and whenever they had a question as to whether what a term meant, they would immediately jump on the web and look up the Nokia Term Bank and see what the definition was. Now, if the term wasn't defined, then the group would have a procedure for deciding whether or not they should submit the term to be possibly defined by their organization later on. The Nokia Term Bank was something that was part of their culture. Everything they did related to it. And it was the one place that was well managed that kept track of all of the descriptive terms that they used about their business. Very, very nice articulation, very, very nice ability to use this wonderful organization to work with until Microsoft got a hold of them, and it's been a mess since then. But it was at least a very, very good example of that. Another example, another company that I've worked with is Walmart, and you'll notice the little spark on the right-hand side of this diagram. Well, that spark they used to define metadata in here. And what they did is they would say metadata is any combination of any circle on that spark and the data in the center that unlocks the value of that data. So they use their own logos to actually help people understand better how important metadata was to the rest of the Walmart organization in there. Now, given that, we can actually take and look at the library example in that same vein. So the who might be the author, the what would be the title, where would be the shelf location, when would be the publication date. And we see that the bottom line of all this is that a small amount of data, metadata, unlocks the large amount of data in the library. Small amount of metadata unlocks the large amount of data in the library. You need a card catalog if you're going to have a library, and nobody has managed to change that since then. One more example on this real quick is that everybody has some variant of an email client, Outlook being the most pervasive. Can you imagine trying to use your email if you couldn't see the what, the subject, like get up here right away, I need you, or priorities, how? Want to filter stuff maybe from your boss to go into a different folder, something that goes into something else? Can you prove you sent it? You use these metadata tools to weed out the junk, find the important stuff. Sometimes people will put rules in, but if I have a question from this person, put it immediately in the trash can, or vice versa, put it immediately in my high priority inbox in order to do this. Imagine how managing email would change if Outlook did not make use of these metadata technologies. And finally, of course, you'll hear this metadata is not really important, but let's give you a couple of examples from our colleagues at the Electronic Future Frontier Foundation. They may know that you rang a phone sex service at 2:24 a.m. and spoke for 18 minutes, but they wouldn't have any idea what you talked about, right? You may have called a suicide prevention hotline from the Golden Gate Bridge, but the topic of the call is, sure, it's a secret, right? Or you spoke to an HIV testing service, then your doctor, then your health insurance company in the same hour. Again, probably we can figure out what's going on. You got a call from the NRA office while it's running a campaign against gun legislation, then you called your senators immediately thereafter, but the content of those calls, we don't know what it is, right? Or talked to a gynecologist, spoke for a bit, and then called Planned Parenthood. Well, yeah, nobody knows what you're talking about. Of course they do. Metadata is incredibly important because metadata unlocks the value of data. And if I were doing a search for something along these lines, I might want to get the phone numbers of all the places that called that phone sex service in the first example so that I could talk to them about it. There was a Supreme Court case last week where the Supreme Court took up a case where somebody had just, they were robbing Radio Shacks, Carpenter versus the U.S., right? They were robbing Radio Shacks, and they were coincidentally, the phone of one of the defendants was present at each of the locations. The question was the government allowed to get that metadata? And it will be an interesting Supreme Court case. It looks optimistically, cautiously, like the Supreme Court will come down with new rights of privacy relative to our metadata. So if the Supreme Court's talking about metadata, you've got that it's important. Let's talk about types. Organizations have the option of managing many different types of architectures. You might have a process architecture, a systems architecture, a business architecture, a security architecture, a technical architecture, a data architecture, and these are some of the many types of architectures that organizations can manage. The fact that they can manage them doesn't mean that they do, but what we do find is that the more organizations spend managing these types of architectures, the more successful they are. There's relatively scant information out there, but I can tell you that the way it works, according to the numbers, is that only 1 in 10 organizations actually tries to manage any of these things, and that 1 in 10 of those manages them well. So just doing this might actually constitute a sustained competitive advantage. Now, each of these topics, and many, many more as you'll see coming up on the next 2 slides, contains its own types of metadata. So therefore, you can have an awful lot of different architectural components that you're looking at around process architecture. There's metadata around systems architecture. There's metadata around your business architecture. There's metadata around your security architecture, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, if each of these are not managed programmatically by the organization, then you have more small piles of metadata. The only thing worse than that are more small piles of data. We'd like all of this to, in fact, be governed by the same language. I have a saying that I use a lot, which is that the language of data governance really must be metadata in order for the entire effort to be seen as effective. So let's look at a couple of specific types of metadata subject areas. Again, we may have analytics. I've worked with a lot of organizations where they're trying to come up with key performance indicators and things like that. All very, very useful. Again, we've already talked about the business architecture, but business definitions. This was the whole purpose of the Nokia term bank, which allowed them to explain different definitions to each other so that they were all using the same kind of definitions. On the other hand, it was also very important for Nokia because Nokia wanted their language of business to be English because they wanted to compete as a world-class organization. They did, and as I said before, it didn't work out as well for them as they wanted it to, but it was not their fault. Business rules, again, standard calculations, derivation methods. Many organizations are now moving away from the complexity of writing those rules up in application code, software, and instead moving them to a more formal management technology, the business rule engine. Data governance, already said, is the language of data governance. Must be metadata. If you're talking about something else, you're probably not focusing your data governance efforts effectively. Data integration, again, don't just hand somebody a spreadsheet and tell me to fill in the blanks. We really need to know that a carrot is a carrot in both systems when we're moving it back and forth. When we're defining what data quality is, again, if you haven't had a chance to sit down on one of those webinars, one of the main lessons from data quality is that you don't want to take all of your data and make it of perfect quality. Even though that sounds like a reasonable goal, it's an unreasonable proposition. What you do need to do is find out which data are important to the key decisions that you're making and make sure that that data is fit for purpose. Document and content management, again, are going to be different areas that have different types of metadata around it. Just the existence of a document is metadata. And interestingly enough, there are a whole series of civil court cases around whether or not somebody has access to an email. I think it was one of the big banks paid $1.5 billion with a B, $1.5 fine for losing an email message that they said they could secure. So again, problematic in that area. Let's keep going. We're going to also talk about information technology infrastructure, the platforms, the licenses. Just ask your organization how many Microsoft licenses it has. It reminds me of an exercise we did when I was with the federal government at one point in time. And they had a really terrific way of counting the number of people in the organization, which was how many Microsoft Office licenses did they have. It turned out that there were 3 times the number of Office licenses as there were people in the organization. Great deal for Microsoft, but probably not so good for the office that we were working for. Of course, the most common area is for conceptual data models, logical data models, and again, we'd like to have the same vocabulary to describe all of this. Already mentioned process models as well. Your information systems portfolio, your IT governance, is going to be focused on metadata. If you're doing services, these are going to be critical for this. If you're doing systems design and development, just keeping track of the requirements so you can come back at a later date and test to see whether all your requirements have been met by the new system. And finally, just systems management, licenses, reliability, performance levels, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are different areas that you can dive into for metadata. And the best organizing taxonomy for all of this is John Zachman's Enterprise Ontology. If you haven't had a chance to see John do talk around this 3rd version of his framework that he's put together, you are truly missing a tremendous intellectual contribution to the field, because this version of it has really taken his previous work, which was excellent, and done some really, really good things to it as well. The idea is, of course, any piece of metadata can be organized according to this ontology. First of all, we may put it in a what, how, where, who, when, and why, the 6 interrogatives that we have. And we may classify that according to executive, business management, architectural, engineering, technical, and enterprise perspectives going down the side. John has done a wonderful job of this. We could spend the entire hour on just this diagram and metadata. We can't at this point in time, but again, if you haven't had a chance to do this, look it up. There is plenty of stuff on the web out there that will help you understand it. So those are the major types and subject areas. Let's look at some specific benefits around metadata. There are 7 of them here. Increasing the strategic value of information, unlocking the value of information. We've covered that one before. Most people don't think about it, but metadata actually reduces training costs, and I'll show you a specific example on that in a little bit. It can help us lower the impact of staff turnover and allow us to understand documentation, origin of systems, et cetera, et cetera. My favorite example of number 2 here was that I worked with the Marine Corps Total Force System, and the Marines were so well organized, they knew exactly what they knew and exactly what they didn't know. And they had a whole room that at the end of the year they would put their year-end money into bringing their system up to speed, and they could tell us the data in our system is documented as of this date, the process model is documented as of this date, the technical spec is documented as of this date. They knew exactly what they knew in there. Of course, you can reduce research time by assisting business analysts finding the information in a timely fashion. And number 3 really encapsulates the problem, if you will, with what we call now data science. Data science, first of all, it's too abstract a term to be useful, but nevertheless, everybody wants to be a data scientist because McKinsey called it the sexiest job of the 21st century, and everybody, of course, wants to be sexy. What it really comes down to is that data scientists spend 80% of their time munging the data and 20% of their time actually applying their craft to the process. That is a horrible waste of misuse of resources, and most organizations are blissfully unaware of it. We're going to see that bubble burst sometime soon. It improves the communication by bridging the gap between business users and IT professionals, leveraging the work done by other teams, and increasing confidence in the various data pieces. Again, the key here is the language of data governance must be metadata. That's all that number 4 says. If you have good metadata for your systems, you can reduce your time to market by reducing the development time in that process. Again, it's just documentation and instructions. You will reduce the risk of project failure in a major way, and finally, you will reduce the amount of redundancy because, of course, if I have 2 piles of data that are both labeled name, I only need one. It's kind of like a watch. Having 2 of them doesn't help. whereas having one of them that is accurate is a much better way of approaching the whole process. Now, when we talk about these benefits, we should dive into a couple of other quick areas as well, because you'll see these positioned a lot. Most people get sort of some hype where they say, I'm going to turn your unstructured data into structured data. And every time somebody says that to me, I put a glass of water in front of them and say, I'd really prefer you to turn this water into wine, because frankly, that would be much more useful to me. The whole definition of unstructured data is absolutely not correct the way it's described, but metadata describes both of these. Metadata for what we really should call a semi-structured data exists in a lot of different formats. So, for example, we might have content management. University websites are now being seen as authoritative sources, collections of journals, et cetera, et cetera. And the common classification for them is to start tagging them with various different metadata tags. You'll see this happen a lot. There's a fair amount of unstructured, again, type of things out there, which just doesn't help. So my preferred term on this is absolutely to say, no, let's not do it that way. Let's instead call it semi-structured data or tabular and non-tabular data if we're really going to get it right. But the other part of this is there's been a tremendous amount of work. Now, I got to go to Dublin, Ireland last month for the board meeting that we had over there. It was terrific, and I love the city. Very hospitable group and just a very vibrant place. But it reminds me of a foolish joke that I had happen to me earlier on. I was in Belfast maybe 20 years before that, hinting around, somebody please invite me to Dublin so I can see the city that was there. And I said something about the Dublin core, and somebody put their hand up and said, Dr. Aiken, that would be Dublin, Ohio you're trying to get to, not Dublin, Ireland. Now, the Dublin core is a group of librarians that got together many, many years ago and said, what data do we need to do to manage stuff that's in libraries? You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and that's a major takeaway from this. We have lots and lots of sources of metadata that we'll talk about where you can get access to some of these things. If you are dealing with stuff that would normally go in the library and you ignore the Dublin core, you ignore it at your peril. So there's a lot of structural metadata around these. In fact, most books in this presentation are all falling from exactly the same kind of a process. Can you imagine if I just sort of put these slides together and then presented them to you all in a random order? Probably wouldn't be very popular around that, although it might make an interesting puzzle for some of us to work on. So we use metadata in all kinds of ways. Let me give you a business value example here. And this was a company that our university here was involved in a couple of years back called Envera. Now, the context here, I'm going to narrate over a little bit of narration. There's two companies that talk to each other, and when they talk to each other, they can talk to through a number of different ways, placing orders, invoices, shipments, et cetera, on this. And each of those things can be transferred by phone, fax, and email, in fact, even electronically back and forth. What Envera's business proposition was that they said, we're going to take this massive amount of communication that everybody is still suffering with today and try to fix it in some fashion. And the way they were going to fix it was by understanding the metadata by types. And of course, by the way, it's not just company A talking to all these other companies. Each of those other companies talks to themselves as well. So they shrink it down a little bit and put Envera, which was the wonderful technology in here, and all they were doing was managing the metadata flows that occurred from company A to company B. So instead of having point-to-point connectivity all over the place, they instead created spoke and hub models in order to do this. From a business value perspective, they use this diagram here where they said, look at all the things that depend on metadata. And the answer was just about everything else in the business depends on all of this metadata. So the business value of metadata is really clear to some people and completely not clear to others. As data professionals, your job is to help articulate this to the organization itself so that the organization can understand what it is that it's attempting to do and how data and metadata can add value to that proposition. I'm going to give you a specific example here now, just showing you a number of different sources where data can come from. This is just one example that we were working with for an organization. They had a reference model. They had bought something called ADRM, which is a retail data model. They also had a conceptual model of their business that had been developed 2 years ago. It was useful, it was old, dated, but not too old and too dated that it wasn't of use. They also had some existing systems that they wanted to have reverse engineered, and finally they had an enterprise data model. All of these things together provided no one of them the individual total picture, but with all 4 of these components that they had, they were able to get much better insight to what was going on in their specific environments as they were working through the specific business problems. So again, just to show you a specific example there. Now let's look at some implementation considerations. As I said, I used to call this the data strategy piece. I'm not sure it's really worthy of a strategy on this. I'd rather have you do a data strategy than a metadata strategy. But still, the question is, how do you convince somebody to invest in metadata? Because if you're going to do it, you don't really want to dabble in it. You want to plan, budget, apply resources for it. You need to have a case for why metadata is important. You need to be able to talk about what technologies that are in there and that will get people's attention. And here's the main problem that we have in metadata. It's something that many of you will remember as IBM's application development cycle information model. In the late 80s, IBM sat down and did a marvelous job of coming up with all the metadata you would need in order to do anything in technology. And you know what? They were right. The problem? It doesn't scale. This is a completely impractical approach. So unfortunately, even though this is a good effort and it is still out there, you can get a hold of parts of this if you need to look at it. So don't start off with nothing, right? There's nothing worse than pretending nothing exists at all. You do want to look at this, look for this, because it has all sorts of ways in which these components of metadata connect to each other. But the reason it was a laughing stock of this is because nobody maintains all of it. And that's unfortunately the message that people heard. It was not the message IBM tried to convey, but it was the message that was heard. Oh, just do all of this stuff and your world will be perfect. Well, that's kind of like saying spend all your time doing to-do lists, but never actually check any of the items off of your to-do list. And so this is one of the reasons that it was a good effort. It is a wonderful reference model, but it is not something you're going to go promise management. Let me work on metadata for 5 years and everything will get better. It's not going to be selling. There are specific roles and responsibilities. We classify them into metadata suppliers, which would include the data stewards, the data architects, the modelers, the database administrators, and other data professionals. We're also, in today's environment, very likely to buy stuff from data brokers. I just finished a lecture that was asked to do on the Equifax breach, which was very interesting in there. The Equifax, of course, had some implications for what's going on. This one may be the straw that broke the camel's back. We'll wait and see on this because we might finally get government involved in it. Of course, you've got participants as well who do this. I won't read them all. And finally, consumers. They are a different group from the participants. You'll see a little bit later on one of the primary problems with metadata is that people build it, but they don't build it to be accessible, and that's really an issue. Now, another really key piece of metadata strategy here, if you will, is to realize that metadata really isn't a noun. Unfortunately, anybody's data can be somebody else's metadata. And if you don't believe me, pull me up some examples at the end of the session here, and we'll turn them around pretty quick. But metadata is much more of a verb because it represents a use of a fact rather than the type of data itself. See, the problem when people get excited about metadata, they start to run around and look at things and say, oh, hey, is this metadata? And the answer is it could be, and so therefore I should manage it, right? Well, only if it provides sufficient value for you. So again, metadata is much less of a noun and much more of a verb, or something we call a gerund, a form that is derived from a noun, from a verb, but it functions as a noun. So in other words, if you say, do you mind my asking you, that is a gerund, right? It describes the use of the data rather than a type of data. And that is so critical to understand, because if you understand that you're using some attributes of data to manage that data at a different, usually higher level of abstraction, then metadata changes from labels to instead of value proposition. is this data worth including within the scope of our efforts? Again, the wrong question is usually, is this metadata? And the right question is, should we include this data item within the scope of our metadata practices? And the answer to that is, under circumstances where it provides you with sufficient value to justify its existence, absolutely you should include it within the scope of your practices. However, if this is one of the 80% of the data items that you have in your organization that are redundant, obsolete, or trivial, no, you should not include it in there, except perhaps to say that maybe we need to call it a synonym to something else that exists in there. So a very, very key question. Do not look at things and say, is it metadata or not? It's the wrong question. The right question is, if this is valuable enough to be included within the scope of our metadata practices. Another very important piece from a metadata perspective is get rid of definitions. Now, I don't mean throw them away, but there's something we can do that's better than definition. And let me tell you a little story about how that occurs. So here's a definition of a bed. A bed is a piece of furniture which is used as a place to sleep or relax, according to Wikipedia. No problem. Here's another description of a bed, but I'm going to, instead of this, use a purpose statement instead of a definition, because a definition just describes what it is. A purpose statement includes why the organization is maintaining information about this business concept. And in this case, this was a piece of metadata from the Veterans Administration piece, and they were going to keep track of beds, right, within rooms. And so they said they had this cool thing where they were going to put an RFID tag on the bed. And that was pretty neat. Well, the source of ID on that, sorry, I'm going to go back one. The problem with the source of the ID on that was that if you put an RFID tag on the bed and say the bed will always show up in some room somewhere, then what has to be a room by definition? And the answer was a hallway. Well, a hallway is not the same thing as a room. By the way, an elevator fell into the same definition because they lose patients in elevators as often as they lose them in hallways at hospitals as well. All very interesting. Remember, hospitals are the third leading cause of death in the United States here. So, purpose statement also includes sources of information about it. In other words, where did it come from? And you see down here the source. We were able to reference a specific manual that was in there. We may have a partial or full list of the attributes that are involved in that. And we also want to have the associations that are there. So again, a bed can be in one room, or a room can contain one bed, or a room can contain many beds, according to the definitions that they had here. Of course, we know there's a physical limitation at some point sooner or later that it will be problematic. So let's take a look at some guidance here in terms of how organizations are told to do their metadata strategies. Again, I don't particularly like the term, but let's say we're going to do some initiation and planning, and we're going to conduct some stakeholder interviews, and we're going to assess the metadata sources, the information architecture, what needs to be done, what do we have already, develop the new metadata architecture, and employ a phased metadata management implementation strategy and plan. And while these are fine, it's missing one important ingredient, because this plan right here is a plan for boiling the ocean. So if you notice on the top, I'm going to say one caveat to this: for one manageable business problem, particularly if it's your first foray into formal metadata management efforts. The reason that's important is because if you try to boil the ocean, you will not actually succeed. But if you take this for a specific area, one aspect of the business, and do these steps for that one piece, you will come up with something that is probably kind of useful. I'm going to show you a slide that we developed out of one of our metadata management initiatives that we were doing for an ERP. Those of you that are close readers on this will understand that this is a PeopleSoft implementation, since those are the PeopleSoft business process definitions. And what we were doing here was helping people to understand what the PeopleSoft system consisted of. So This is a brand new piece of software that they were getting, and they didn't know what they were actually doing, so we counted up the number of steps that were involved in the various processes. Now, let me explain the inner part of this diagram where it says develop workforce, administer workforce, compensate employees, monitor workforce, define business, target system, EDI manager tools. Those are the highest levels that were out there. We ranked them in order, and if somebody said, okay, what does the administer workforce business process look like? It comprises 28.8% of the business. Well, you can see here when we blew that out, again, by counting the number of steps in it, that recruiting the workforce was considerably more complicated than planning successions. Administer training, planning careers, managing positions, all of which were ranked less than 5%, so that there were only really two big important pieces in administer the workforce, which was recruiting them and managing competencies. This type of an explanation as a metadata management exercise provided immediate benefits in that the office that we housed these statistics in, we had eventually put them on the web so everybody could get to them, but at least for the moment we had to start off, we put them in a little access database, and people would come ask us questions and say, well, how do I learn about this new system? We'd say, well, here's what it looks like to administer the workforce. Here's what it looks like to compensate them. Each of these doesn't give you the answer, but it provides you more information towards that. And all we were doing was simply counting up the number of steps that were involved in this, which is a rough surrogate measure of complexity. So I hope that's helpful. You can see how we did it for one exercise. We did not try to manage all of the metadata in PeopleSoft. That was an absurd proposition. It wouldn't have added value to the program. But when we could add value to it quickly and efficiently, we did, and we found not just us, but many other users that like to gain access to this stuff as well. You're going to hear a lot about metadata repositories. It's a very hot term. They are wonderful technologies, but most of them are going to cost you $1 million plus. And for your organization to invest $1 million in anything, they're going to want to know what's going on. So you don't need the repositories. What you need is metadata repository-like functionality. Repository-like functionality. That can be a spreadsheet. It can be a person. Okay. You can build your own metadata repository, and I'll show you a little bit about that in just a minute here. You're going to need some data modeling tools. You probably, of course, have at least SQL Server in your organization, maybe some ETL tools as well. Maybe you have some graphical user interfaces that you can use for your BI, some systems management. It doesn't matter. All of these tools are useful, and you don't have to go out and buy anything new. But unfortunately, if you read, again, the standard stuff on this, they want you to go out and spend $1 million. Now, my colleague Dave Eddy did a really wonderful study a couple of years ago, and the bottom line of all of this is that about 5% of the data dictionaries survive. That's not very good effort. Why would anybody start off with something that was that unsuccessful? And my theory around this is that it's kind of like handing the keys to a brand new Tesla to a 16-year-old driver that has no driving experience. I don't know about you guys, but I just don't expect a good result when you hand somebody a fast, shiny sports car that goes really, really, really far on no gasoline at all and expect good results. Well, what that leaves us is a step process that makes a little bit more sense to me. I would ask you guys, if you're thinking about doing this, to look at building your own repository, because it is possible to develop something that you can use internally. And this is an example of one that we built. The technology was something called Financial Transactions International. And we had to build this because they decided as a feature to stop providing the metadata with the product. So the executive we were working for on this particular process says, okay, well, if they're not going to provide the metadata, then you guys go provide the metadata. So what you're seeing here is an access database, very, very simple in operation. You can pick a table at the top with that click button that's right there. It'll tell you, if you click on the entity, it'll display the name of the entity. You can display the associations. You can go back up to the main menu and take a look at these things. It's not hard to do. Here, let me give you a little better representation of that. There we go. Again, what you're seeing here is a column in table FT_T_ABDF. The column names for that table are shown in the middle there with the sort of golden color around it. We can also, oops, I'm going to go back. We can also look at the primary key and see that the primary key for that ACTG_BAS_ID is used as primary key in 3 other tables in this system. So if I'm going to make a change there, I now know what I need to do. I can also click on that column, AGTBASID, and see that it's a type character for in links, and again, some other metadata around it. If I want to know where it's used in a foreign key, I can click on that and it'll show me where the foreign key is. These things are not hard to build. This is the actual data model, this portion of the data model of the metadata. Okay, so the metadata model that's there. And again, you don't need to start from scratch. I've got a publication that describes this. There are a number of books. David Hay has written some very good books. David Marco and Mike Jennings, and finally Len Silverstone has the biggest, most comprehensive collection of metadata models that are out there for you to do this. So do not start off from ground zero. There's a lot of places that you can use to build on in general. Let's talk about principles on this. Again, provide understanding of the terms, integrate the metadata from the diverse sources that you have, provide easy access to that metadata, and finally ensure that it is of sufficient quality because, of course, garbage in, garbage out. Again, the activities in a metadata management process are to understand the requirements, define the architecture, maintain the standards, implement the managed environment, create and maintain the actual metadata itself, integrate it with other metadata, create that metadata repository-like functionality that I was describing before, distribute and deliver the metadata, and finally give us some access so we can query it. You also want to use standards to some degree appropriately in here. There are 2 major types of standards. Industry or consensus, we call them de facto standards, just as the DMBOK has become the de facto description of data management activities in there. And there's some international standards that are formally defined. So there's a framework that shows how the various standards are related and how they can be used with each other all the way back and forth. Again, from deliverables perspective, we're going to have that functionality that we're looking for. You're going to want to have some quality metadata. I would opt for quality over quantity if you can. You're going to have some sort of analysis around it. You'll be able to start showing lineage or provenance if you want to use a fancier word for it. And now you can start to gauge the impact of change analysis. You can start to want to have metadata control procedures, architectures, and operational analyses in order to pull those together. A couple of guiding principles, actually 15 of them. Establish, maintain a clear approach for that metadata practice. Remember, take one goal and focus on it. Build local but architect globally, right? Secure some sort of sustained commitment, and a pretty loudmouth executive doesn't hurt as well in there. Get an enterprise perspective so that you can implement and deliver incrementally but architect globally. Make sure that you put your people and processes in place before evaluating, purchasing, and installing technologies. And yet what happens is time after time we see people bought something. I know of one company up here on the East Coast that has bought a metadata repository and paid software license on it for 20 years and has never actually used the thing. So they can say they have a metadata repository, they just aren't really using it. Again, make sure that you have standards to ensure enterprise interoperability. Look at acquisition approaches for both internal and external data, maximize the user access. Keep going. Understand, communicate the necessity. This is storytelling. You've got to be able to tell stories about it. You've got to be able to measure the content and usage, which means turning it into dollars at some point. Don't forget about XML. I wrote a whole book on how to do this, and for some reason people seem to think that was an old technology. It's not. It's a very useful technology. Make sure that you've got business-wide involvement in the stewardship functions. Get procedures. Make sure that you monitor that they are put in place. Look at staffing in particular. Make that you have dedicated metadata experts. That'll come back to haunt me, I'm sure. And, of course, make sure that you can attest to the metadata quality. We've just got a couple minutes here left. I said I wanted to leave you with a specific teachable example. I think it's important to have one of those because if you can demonstrate it to other people using any computer around, then it becomes super, super easy to tell other people about it. And I've had a lot of success with this example. Everybody tends to know what iTunes is, even if you're not an Apple fan. The software is freely available and you can get it. Now, let's go back to the time when I used to load a CD into my computer, okay? If I loaded that CD into the iTunes application here, it would come up and tell me that I had 25 tracks, 25 songs. It would tell me the number of songs that are on there. So again, I insert this thing in there, I put the CD in, and iTunes goes, well, there's 25 places. I can tell how long each track is, and that's about it. And then what happens is, if you're connected to the internet, it goes out and starts querying something called the gracenote.com. Gracenote is a company that decided they wanted to become a media database of all the metadata. And it looked at the signature of that CD, the digital signature of that CD, and it returned the CD name, the artist, the track names, the genre, the artwork for it. Sure would have been a pain to type all that stuff in itself, wouldn't it? And that's really, really nice of them to provide that kind of access. So now I say, okay, cool. I've got a Miles Davis CD in my computer, and I'd like to make a playlist out of that Miles Davis CD. Well, once again, I can employ metadata to do that by creating what we call a smart playlist in the Apple product. Most products allow you to do the same thing, and I'm simply saying in this playlist, match the following rule. The rule is that the artist contains the words Miles and Davis. And when I hit OK, it creates for me another playlist here. You'll see there's my Miles Davis playlist, although notice I didn't get the desired results because it turns out in my iTunes library, I already had another Miles Davis recording live at the Fillmore East. So I need to fine-tune that request. If I want a Miles Davis and I want only that one, I need to add another line to that original request. Put things in that smart folder that are both Miles Davis's and the album contains the complete Birth of the Cool. Now I can move the playlist Miles Davis into a folder so it makes sense in order to do that. If you can do this with these things, you can do this with your photographs, you can do these with your movies, you can do these with your videos, you can do this with your documents, you can do this with all kinds of things if the metadata is well specified. Now we're thankful that somebody somewhere decided to put this stuff out at Grace Notes because it sure would have been a pain to do it all by ourselves. And again, like a watch, we only want one of them. So we let Grace Notes be the major access on this. Now I want to do one more thing here on our little example, and that is to show that this exact process gives you exactly the same interface for doing the movies, the data structures to podcasts, to books, PDF files, anything else. So once I've done this well once with metadata, I can apply that metadata taxonomy to all sorts of things, giving us enormous advantages of scale in order to do this. So that's the teachable example. I hope that's useful to you guys. We've got just a couple minutes left for some takeaways. First one here is, again, remember that metadata management is data about data, but that's an inadequate definition. So one we prefer is metadata unlocks the value of data and therefore requires management attention, but you still have metadata engineering, metadata storage, metadata delivery, and again, this gets to our sources and uses of metadata all the way into it. But that metadata is much less about what and much more about how, and that is a really key distinction because that will help you keep your focus, your efforts focused on things that deliver specific value. Metadata must be the language of data governance, and it defines the essence of your various specific integration challenges here. So we're back around at the top of the hour, and what we've talked about is context of data management and how metadata is important. What is it? What are the various types and subject areas? What are the benefits? What are the implementation considerations? Giving you some guiding principles and building blocks and hopefully a specific teachable example. In this packet, I've also included a number of references and recommended pieces of reading from you here. Allow you to get deeper into this subject should you desire more information or just have trouble sleeping at night. And now we get, of course, to the best part of this, which is time for questions. So I'll throw it back over to Shannon and see if you guys have questions at this point.
Peter, thank you so much for another great presentation, especially on such a hot topic that I know is so important to all of our community. So just diving in here to the questions, and to answer the most commonly asked question, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday with links to the slides and the recording of the session and anything else requested throughout. And if you've got questions, submit them in the Q&A in the bottom right-hand corner. And then just getting started here, Peter, what do most metadata management tools focus around in terms of metadata subject areas?
That's a great one. The subject areas are not actually all that critical in the sense that most of them are self-definable at this point. We used to, for example, say that, oh, metadata's got to start out with a data metadata and then work its way up from there. So I'll go back to the slide here, which is showing the metadata model that we created for the FTI example that I was describing to you earlier. And if you look here, you'll see starting in the upper left-hand corner, attribute name relates to attribute domains, and attribute domains are related to specific attributes. That's a very flexible data structure that allows you to define a number of different constructs. The same type of construct then falls down to we have attributes that are related to entity descriptions that are related to entity names. Then we have a physical short name and a table name and a column detail. So this is where most metadata efforts start, is to try and keep track of this stuff. I have to deviate here from just a little bit and tell everybody on the call here that because of the inadequacy of the university training system that we have in this country in particular and in general worldwide, I've seen a couple of exceptions, but the vast majority of them don't even teach students what the word metadata means or its importance to this. And what that means is that we literally will take them through a course such as systems analysis and design and have them maintain the metadata by paper. And the students look at this and say, oh my, hasn't anybody figured a better way to do this? And the textbooks do not even reference the fact that there are tools out there to do this. And I just scared the hell out of everybody because I was pounding on my desk, but I did that for emphasis. So I'm here in a university situation and describing that to you and telling you that it is a major, major problem. So we're not even letting students know that there are tools out there that they can use, and they come out and they become your employees, and then they go, oh, this is cool. I wonder why they didn't teach it to us in college and university. And the answer is because college and university are doing a tremendous disservice to all of our students on this. But the good news is everybody on this call will have guaranteed employment for life because of that specific failure around that. So I hope I answered that question, but it doesn't mean that your tools are limited to those types of things. They can just as easily be modified to include process metadata and other things by changing and making flexible and adaptable models, and virtually all of them do this. So long-winded answer.
They're changing, right? How quickly universities are changing their programs to adapt to the quickly changing landscape. But so Peter, how do you see the agile development movement and its tendency to downplay the importance of documentation of multiple kinds, for example, metadata?
So the agile software movement is a wonderful movement that is focused on creating better quality software faster. And as long as they stick to that scope, they do very, very well. I get very leery when I see things like agile enterprise architecture and things like that, which are really very, very different things. Now, let's remember, agile is a project. And a project is something with a beginning and an end and specific definable outcomes from that. Data is not a project. Data is a program. And so data cannot, by definition, fit into an agile model. Agile can be very complementary to how data works, but data does not take a second seat to agile. If you think about it, whatever development method that you use, whether it is a software development method such as Agile, or whether you're doing Kanban or any of the other things that are doing, or just the traditional SDLC, all of those things are projects. And the only way those projects can succeed from a data perspective is if there is no data sharing outside of that project. If data is shared outside of that project, you need another project to make sure that that project integrates in with the other project, which means you now have 3 projects instead of 2. It is the most hilarious situation I've ever seen, and yet organizations try as hard as they can to make this stuff fit. It just doesn't work. So big, big problems with that. It's not that Agile is bad. Agile is very, very good at developing better software. But let's stick to what they do, which is developing software, which is considerably different from developing programmatic, shareable data assets. And that's what we need to do from our data perspective.
So are there established standards for metadata for unstructured or semi-structured data?
There are. Most of them evolve around tagging, and it turns out the U.S. federal government has actually done a really good job of getting started with some of them. There are some federal information processing standards and some guidance out of NIST that will help this. We're working on some efforts right now where we're hoping that the states will not reinvent this wheel and that they can use all of this themselves. Imagine the effort that goes on. If somebody takes some data from the federal government that's well tagged and says, well, now we need to redo it for our purposes because we're different here in, oh, let's just say Alabama for today's sake, right? It's really not a good process, particularly when you talk about things such as national security. So there are standards that we can use, IEEE, ACM, these other groups that do standards work, NIST, lots of good things around that. But there are also lots of just good template books. I mentioned several of them already. Again, Len Silverstone's David Hay, David Marco, and Mike Jennings all have written very, very good books giving you some of these basic models that you can get. So again, I wouldn't expect you to build from what I have here on the screen, although it is absolutely buildable directly from the screen, but look up at some of these other references, take a look at this. Again, I give you the reference here for the article, give you a little bit of guidance around that area. So yes, do not start off from scratch. It is a silly exercise. There's so much out there. Again, I had a question the other day. It was really interesting. Somebody said, hey, have you ever developed a data model for a health insurance billing system? And I said, you know, I haven't, but I bet I know somebody who knows whether one exists. And literally, Len Silverstone showed up at my door. It was in June last year, whatever webinar we were doing that day, Shannon. And Len said, yep, I've got one right here in the book. And he pointed it out, and there it was. So it's probably been done before.
So, Peter, so have you given or will you consider giving a presentation on the best practices for developing taxonomies of name parts associated with standard data elements based on the classification scheme described in the ISO IEC standard on metadata registries?
So you'll notice Shannon's title here. She gets to determine an awful lot of that, and by asking that question, she'll at least consider it, right?
Absolutely. I don't know if we have it booked in 2018, but maybe we can look at that for sure. Yeah, I don't know if you have any. Yeah. So describe the interaction between metadata and a business rule.
I wish I had an example that I could show you. So a business rule, first of all, let's talk about, remember, metadata is not so much a what as a how. So if a business rule exists, and I'm going to make a very simple one here just because I was doing credit card fraud earlier and somehow that led into drinking, and so we'll pretend that the drinking age of 21 is in question here. So if somebody wants to ask the question whether Peter can purchase an adult beverage, the business rule might be if his driver's license says he's older than 21 years of age, he can buy alcoholic beverages, right? So that's a business rule. The existence of whether that is there or not, in other words, do we know what the drinking age is, or is there a drinking age, is itself metadata. The fact that where is the metadata stored, well, maybe the only piece of ID that I have on me is my school ID. Well, my school ID doesn't tell whether I'm a faculty or a student or a staff or anything else in there, so school ID is probably not going to get me the beer that I want. In there. By the way, I just have to say, I mentioned I was down with the Dame Atlanta chapter, and one of the other things I got to try in Atlanta was something most of you are going to hate, but it turned out to be perfect for me on that night. There's a new beer, a cider out there called the Lime in the Coconut. Larry, shout out to you, right? Good stuff. Good stuff. Anyway, the business rule, yes, that is metadata, and if it uses terms in there, that is metadata, but that's not the way to think of it. The way to think of it is, do I have something that I can reference that will allow me to have access to the drinking rule, if that's what the drinking rule is going to be called in there. So business rules, whether they exist or not, is metadata. The actual content of the business rules is metadata. And whether the business rule was applied to the transaction. Did you check Peter's ID? Well, that's metadata too. Right? If they didn't check my ID, then it's the establishment's fault for not properly vetting the alcoholic beverage consumers that are in there. I hope that's helpful. If it's not, please ask another question because it's a really important point.
So are there open source metadata tools worth looking into?
Absolutely. I don't have any examples here right now, but every semester, because the university doesn't provide the students with one and because I tend to teach elective classes, I have them go out and find them, and I know there's several that are worth looking at. Most of them start to be in the open source community evolving around software development, but it's not to say that you can't use them for other types of metadata management. Again, all the repository is some place where you're storing data about data, and so that'll give you a good insight into that.
So in industry, there is a principle where code is the documentation. Can properly structured APIs and examples like Kimball Data Bus Service or serve as discoverable metadata without needing to catalog it centrally? Is there a body of knowledge that speaks to that?
The general practices around that discourage that. I can tell you that in 33 years of being in this business, about 2/3 of the time I walk in and they tell me whatever information you need, you're going to have to get it from the production system. So that's where I got started doing reverse engineering around this whole process. And you can go in and reverse engineer the APIs and things like that. And if they are accessible and useful, that can serve as very good documentation because now you don't have to ask what is in production and what, do I think this is in production in there. Only about 1/3 of the time do we actually have well-defined metadata maintained in the organization. So one of the things I've been urging people to do is to get better at reverse engineering techniques so that they can go in and discover this metadata very, very quickly. The whole profiling movement around data quality is also complementary to what we're doing as well.
So any comments regarding the integration of graph models to enhance metadata or meta models?
Well, so graph models are a specialized representation type, and just as other types of tools are also useful, depending on what you're trying to do. Yes, absolutely, graph models can be incredibly useful, particularly when you're looking at spatial data or other types of data that is not easily represented in tabular formats, and this can be incredibly helpful. But we'd need an example to take a look at that to make it more useful.
Well, that's all the questions. If you got any more questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A in the bottom right-hand corner. Just a reminder, I will be sending out a follow-up email by end of day Thursday with links to the slides, links to the recording of the session, and anything else requested. Peter, thank you so much for another great presentation. Again, it's just one of our hottest topics, metadata. It crosses all boundaries, all disciplines within data management, and just so important to cover. So thanks for wrapping up the year with that.
And Shannon, happy holidays to you and yours, and good luck with the concerts coming up. I know you got a bunch of good ones. It should be a lot of fun. Sorry I'm not there to see them.
Yeah, likewise. And thanks all of our attendees for being so engaged in everything we do, and I hope you all have a happy holidays, and see you on the flip side.
Back in January, we'll be here for data strategy. Start the year off right. Take care, everybody. Thanks,
Cheers.
Shannon. Bye-bye.